The scrape of mortar and the heavy thud of stone echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. Brick by brick, masons sealed Queen Joanna of Castile deeper into her prison, each stone shrinking her world, until all that remained was a final, fading glimmer of light. "Please," she might have whispered, her voice lost to the indifferent scrape of trowels. "Show mercy." But mercy had vanished long ago, replaced by darkness absolute. Watching silently from the shadows was the man responsible for this cruel entombment, not a foreign conqueror nor a treacherous rival, but her own son, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. It was not enough to imprison his mother. He had decided she must vanish entirely, erased from existence while her heart still beat. What sin had Joanna committed? How could a princess, brilliant and beloved, once third in line to the throne, end up sealed alive behind stone by her own child? What twisted web of ambition and betrayal led 3 generations of powerful men to convince the world their queen was mad, paving the path to her living grave? Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It is the surest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past. The cheering crowds had no idea they were celebrating a future prisoner. In 1496, 16-year-old Joanna stood on the dock at Laredo, ready to board the ship that would carry her to her new life. Castilian nobles waved silk banners. Musicians played triumphant fanfares. Her mother, the great Isabella, had arranged everything perfectly. Joanna spoke 6 languages fluently. She'd studied philosophy with the finest tutors in Europe. Her reddish-gold hair caught the light like spun copper, earning her the nickname Joanna the Fair. She was the jewel of the Spanish royal family, sailing off to marry Philip the Handsome of Burgundy and forge an alliance that would reshape European power. But here's where it gets truly chilling. As Joanna climbed the gangplank, she paused. Witnesses would later recall this moment, how she turned back towards Spain, her hand pressed to her chest, as if something deep inside warned her. She stood frozen for a full minute while courtiers whispered nervously. Then she shook her head and continued aboard. That ship would become her first prison, though she didn't know it yet. The voyage to Flanders took 3 weeks. Joanna spent most of it studying Flemish customs and practicing French pronunciation. She memorized the names of every Burgundian noble she'd meet. She wanted to be perfect for Philip, this husband she'd never met but whose portrait made her heart race. Handsome didn't begin to describe him. Golden-haired, athletic, with eyes that seemed to promise adventure. Her ladies-in-waiting giggled over love poems she wrote during the journey. One fragment survived. "My soul flies ahead of these slow sails, racing toward you, my unknown beloved." She had no idea she was racing toward her destruction. The Burgundian fleet appeared on the horizon on August 26, 1496. Joanna stood at the bow, her finest gown whipping in the wind. Courtiers later described her face radiant with anticipation, her intelligent eyes scanning the approaching shore. She was thinking about the children she'd have, the court she'd establish, the books she'd collect in her new library. But something strange happened as they approached the harbour. The Burgundian ships didn't display the welcoming banners custom demanded. No music drifted across the water. The docks seemed strangely empty for the arrival of a future duchess. Joanna's Spanish advisors exchanged worried glances, but she refused to show concern. "Perhaps they have different customs here," she said brightly. The truth was far worse. Philip hadn't bothered to meet her ship. Instead, a minor official greeted them with stiff formality. He informed Joanna that Duke Philip was unfortunately detained by pressing matters. She would be escorted to Lear Abbey to rest from her journey. The Spanish delegation erupted in outrage. This breach of protocol was a calculated insult. But Joanna raised her hand for silence. "I'm sure my husband has excellent reasons," she said with quiet dignity. She maintained that dignity for 3 days of waiting, 3 days of messages sent and ignored, 3 days of growing whispers among her Spanish ladies. On the 4th day, Philip finally appeared, riding into the abbey courtyard with studied casualness. Joanna watched from her window as he dismounted, laughing with his Flemish courtiers, in no apparent hurry. Their first meeting should have warned her. Philip entered her chambers without ceremony, looked her up and down like a merchant appraising goods, and spoke in rapid French, knowing her French was imperfect. When she asked him to speak slower, he rolled his eyes and switched to Latin cold, formal Latin. the language of contracts, not lovers. But then something shifted. As Joanna responded in perfect Latin, discussing Aristotle's views on governance, Philip's expression changed. Interest flickered in those beautiful eyes. By the time she seamlessly switched to discussing Burgundian trade routes in accented but clear Flemish, he was leaning forward, genuinely engaged. The courtiers later reported that the room seemed to crackle with sudden chemistry. They were married within the week. The wedding night would produce their first child, Eleanor, exactly 9 months later. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a fairy tale after all. Joanna wrote to her mother about Philip's ardent attention and her complete happiness. She had no idea that Philip's ardour was already cooling, that he'd begun meeting with advisors about how to control this unexpectedly brilliant wife. The ship carrying her to her new husband would become her first prison, and her marriage bed would become her first cell. The moment Joanna stepped onto Flemish soil, the trap began closing. She just couldn't see the bars yet. Philip the Handsome knew exactly what kind of wife he'd wanted. Beautiful, silent, and pliable. What he got was a multilingual intellectual who expected to rule beside him. His solution came swift and brutal. It started small. First, he dismissed her Spanish ladies one by one. "They make you homesick," he said, stroking her hair as she protested. "You need to embrace your new home." When Joanna's closest companion, Maria de Mendoza, was sent away, Joanna wept for 3 days. Philip responded by locking her chambers, claiming she needed rest for her delicate constitution. But Joanna was anything but delicate. She spoke out in council meetings, suggesting reforms to the tax system that would have enriched Burgundy's coffers. The Flemish nobles shifted uncomfortably as this foreign princess demonstrated a sharper grasp of economics than their duke. Philip's jaw tightened with each word she spoke. The punishment came that night. "You embarrassed me," he hissed, gripping her wrists hard enough to leave bruises. "Women don't speak in my council." When Joanna tried to respond, he walked out, not returning to their chambers for a week. She learned the pattern quickly. Intelligence meant isolation. Here's where the psychological torture truly began. Philip discovered his wife's deepest weakness. She genuinely loved him. He weaponized that love with surgical precision. Days of passionate attention followed by weeks of cold absence. Lavish gifts paired with public humiliation. He'd praise her beauty at banquets, then loudly discuss his mistress's superior charms. Joanna, raised in the rigid moral court of Isabella of Castile, couldn't comprehend this casual cruelty. The Flemish courtiers watched it all with knowing smirks. They had a new entertainment, watching their duke break his Spanish bride like a willful horse. Some later admitted feeling pity as they saw her waiting by windows for his return, straightening her gown when his footsteps echoed in the hall, only to have him pass by without acknowledgement. But then came the letters from Spain that changed everything. Isabella was dying. The crown of Castile would pass to Joanna. Suddenly, Philip's difficult wife would become queen of one of Europe's richest kingdoms. His entire demeanour transformed overnight. The mistresses vanished. The tenderness returned. He even attended Mass with her, knowing her deep faith. Joanna should have been suspicious, but love makes fools of brilliant women too. She wrote to her dying mother about Philip's wonderful transformation and her renewed happiness. She didn't know Philip was already meeting with lawyers about Castilian succession law. She didn't know he was studying how a husband could rule through a wife deemed incapacitated. The words started appearing in diplomatic correspondence. Fragile. Philip's letters to other European courts mentioned his wife's delicate mental state and her unfortunate episodes of distress. When Joanna learned of these letters, she confronted him with rare fury. His response was masterful in its cruelty. He sighed sadly and said, "See, this irrational anger proves my concerns." The isolation intensified. Philip stationed guards at her door. For her protection, he claimed. Her correspondence was read before delivery. Visitors were screened and often turned away. When she protested, he'd shake his head sadly and speak of her wild imaginings. The Flemish court learned to mirror his concerned expressions whenever the Duchess appeared. But Joanna fought back with the only weapons left to her. She began refusing food when Philip denied her requests. She would kneel in the chapel for hours, praying loudly enough for the entire castle to hear her pleas for divine justice. Once, when Philip locked her in her chambers for speaking to a Spanish merchant, she smashed every piece of Flemish pottery she could find, creating such a racket that foreign ambassadors asked uncomfortable questions. "My wife suffers from melancholic episodes," Philip would explain smoothly. "It's a family condition, I'm told. We pray for her recovery." The most horrifying part? Joanna began to doubt herself. When you're told you're mad often enough, when everyone around you performs concern for your sanity, when your own perceptions are constantly challenged, don't you start to wonder? She found herself checking her reactions, moderating her voice, watching for signs of this madness everyone seemed to see but her. Philip had discovered the perfect formula. You don't need chains to imprison someone, you just need to make them doubt their own mind. And once he planted those seeds of doubt, they would grow into a forest thick enough to hide a queen for half a century. The ship carrying her to her new husband would become her first prison, but her marriage itself had become a locked room with walls made of whispers and lies. For months, Joanna refused to bury her husband's corpse. This single fact would echo through centuries, the proof of her madness repeated in every history book. But listen to what really happened in those terrible months of 1506, and you'll understand why a brilliant woman might clutch a coffin like a lifeline. Philip died suddenly in Burgos, after playing a vigorous game of ball and drinking cold water. Within hours, the 28-year-old Duke was burning with fever. Within days, he was dead. Joanna held his hand as he died, whispering prayers and promises. The Flemish courtiers swore she smiled, but Spanish witnesses saw only a woman in shock. Now here's what the histories don't tell you. The moment Philip's eyes closed, the vultures descended. Flemish nobles burst into the death chamber, already dividing his possessions. Spanish courtiers pushed forward, declaring Joanna's sovereignty. Everyone wanted something from the 26-year-old widow who'd just become Queen of Castile in her own right. But Joanna did something unexpected. She refused to leave Philip's body. "He needs me," she said simply, positioning her chair beside his coffin. When pressed, she elaborated with perfect logic. "Everyone wants to use him, even dead. They want him buried in Flanders to claim my children. They want him in Spain to legitimize my rule. I won't let them have him." Think about that for a moment. She wasn't mad with grief. She was protecting the one thing she could still control. Philip's body had become a political chess piece, and she'd turned it into a shield. As long as she kept vigil, no one could force immediate decisions about her future or her children's. The funeral procession that followed deserves reconsideration too. Yes, she travelled through Spain with Philip's coffin. But look at the route. It exactly matched the path needed to assert her queenly authority in rebellious provinces. She stopped at monasteries and churches, certainly, but also at towns that questioned her rule. Nothing says, "I am your legitimate queen," quite like arriving with your predecessor's body. The nocturnal travels that shocked contemporaries? "The heat ruins everything," Joanna explained pragmatically. "We must preserve him properly." She was right. Spanish September. Sun would have made the procession unbearable. Travelling by torchlight also created an unforgettable spectacle. Peasants lined the roads to see their mysterious queen pass like something from a legend. But the propaganda machine had already started. Joanna's own father, Ferdinand of Aragon, needed his daughter weak to maintain his control over Castile. Every practical decision she made was reframed as madness. Checking the body's preservation became obsessive viewing of the corpse. Refusing to let Flemish embalmers take, Philip became jealous guarding of his remains. The most damning story? That she opened the coffin to kiss Philip's feet. Here's what actually happened, according to her own attendants' suppressed testimonies. She discovered the Flemish embalmers had stolen Philip's jewelled boots worth a fortune. She ordered the coffin opened to verify the theft, touched his feet to confirm they were bare, then demanded the thieves be found. By the time this reached Ferdinand's court, she was a necrophiliac madwoman. Watch how brilliantly Ferdinand weaponized his daughter's grief. He spread stories of her refusing to change clothes when she wore traditional mourning dress. Her fasting on holy days became refusing all food. Her prayers for Philip's soul became speaking to his corpse. Each exaggeration built the myth that justified what came next. The heartbreaking truth emerges in her letters from this period, few of which survive. "They watch me always," she wrote to her sister. "If I weep, I am hysterical. If I don't weep, I am unnatural. If I speak of Philip, I am obsessed. If I don't, I am forgetting my duties as widow. There is no right way to grieve when your grief is a political inconvenience. She held out for 5 months. 5 months of protecting Philip's body, while trying to rule a kingdom that increasingly saw her as a mad woman. 5 months of fighting Ferdinand's attempts to seize power, while maintaining the exhausting performance of sanity. 5 months of realizing that her father, the man who'd helped create the legend of her madness, would never let her truly rule. Finally, exhausted and outmaneuvered, she agreed to meet Ferdinand at Hornillo's. She thought they'd negotiate a co-regency. Instead, she found an ambush. Ferdinand arrived with armed men and documents declaring her incapacitated. The trap was sprung. But here's the detail that breaks your heart. She didn't fight. After months of battling for her crown and her dignity, she simply said, "Where do you want me to go?" She'd learned the lesson Philip taught her. When the powerful decide you're mad, resistance only proves their point. Her father had a solution that would horrify even her enemies, and Joanna, the girl who'd mastered 6 languages, was about to learn the only word that mattered was surrender. Ferdinand smiled as he signed his daughter's death warrant. Oh, not literally. The papers simply transferred Joanna to Tordesillas Castle for her health and safety. But make no mistake, when Ferdinand of Aragon affixed his seal to those documents in February 1509, he was burying his daughter alive. The worst part? He knew exactly what he was doing. Tordesillas wasn't chosen randomly. Ferdinand had personally inspected this riverside fortress, noting its high walls, limited windows, and crucially, its distance from any nobles who might sympathize with their rightful queen. He ordered specific modifications: bars on windows, locks that only opened from outside, walls built across corridors to limit movement. He was designing a prison that didn't look like one. "My beloved daughter needs rest," Ferdinand told the Cortes, his voice dripping paternal concern. "The burdens of rule have overwhelmed her delicate mind. At Tordesillas, she'll have peace, prayer, and proper care." The nobles nodded sympathetically. After all, they'd heard the stories about the coffin, the midnight travels, the wild grief. Poor mad Joanna. But listen to what happened when they brought her to Tordesillas. Joanna walked through the gates with dignity, examined her quarters, and said quietly, "I see." That was all. Just, "I see." She understood this wasn't temporary. She recognized a tomb when she saw one. Ferdinand appointed Luis Ferrer as her keeper, a man whose previous experience included managing dangerous prisoners, not doctors, notice, not companions, a jailer. Ferrer's first report back to Ferdinand reveals the cold efficiency. The queen is secured. She has 2 rooms, a small chapel, and a walkway of 20 paces, sufficient for her needs. 20 paces. That's what the Queen of Castile's world had shrunk to. 20 paces back and forth, like an animal in a cage. Now here's where Ferdinand's cruelty reached new depths. He didn't just imprison his daughter, he erased her. Royal decrees stopped mentioning Queen Joanna, referring instead to the lady at Tordesillas. Her name vanished from prayers. Her image disappeared from royal ceremonies. It was as if she'd died, except death would have been kinder. But Joanna refused to cooperate with her own erasure. She demanded royal protocol be observed. When servants failed to address her properly, she wouldn't acknowledge them. When meals arrived without the proper ceremony due a queen, she sent them back untouched. "I am not mad," she told anyone who'd listen. "I am your queen, imprisoned by a usurper." Ferdinand's response was swift and brutal. He restricted her visitors to pre-approved lists. He assigned servants who spoke no Castilian, ensuring she couldn't build allies. He even controlled her access to confessors, fearing she might pass messages through the sanctity of confession. The woman who spoke 6 languages was surrounded by people instructed not to understand her. The truly diabolic touch? Ferdinand maintained the fiction of consulting her on state matters. Messengers would arrive with urgent questions for Her Majesty. Joanna would provide thoughtful, intelligent responses about tax reform or foreign alliances. Ferdinand would then ignore every word and tell the court, "See how her mind wanders. She speaks of impossible things." Her very intelligence became evidence of madness. Here's a detail that chills the blood. Ferdinand visited exactly once. In 1510, he came to Tordesillas to comfort his afflicted daughter. Witnesses describe Joanna's desperate hope. Surely her father would see the injustice, would restore her freedom. Instead, Ferdinand spent 2 hours lecturing her on accepting God's will, then left orders to restrict her movement further. As his carriage departed, servants heard her screaming, not mad ravings, but one word, over and over: "Father, Father, Father." The isolation wasn't just physical. Ferdinand ensured Joanna knew nothing of the outside world. She didn't know when her own mother Isabella had died. Ferdinand kept that secret for months. She wasn't told of her children's marriages, her grandchildren's births, the wars fought in her name. Time itself became her enemy, each day identical to the last, marked only by bells she couldn't see and seasons glimpsed through barred windows. But the worst betrayal was yet to come. In his final years, Ferdinand grew paranoid about his legacy. What if future generations questioned the legality of Joanna's imprisonment? His solution was breathtaking in its cynicism. He spread new stories of her violence, her danger to herself and others. He paid witnesses to swear they'd seen her attack servants, refuse food for weeks, speak to invisible demons. None of it was true. But truth doesn't matter when power writes the history. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Joanna had been in Tordesillas for 7 years. 7 years of 20-pace walks. 7 years of enforced silence. 7 years of being told she was mad, until madness seemed like mercy. But Ferdinand's death would bring not freedom, but a more terrible jailer one she'd given birth to, nursed at her breast, and loved with the fierce devotion only a mother knows. Charles had waited 17 years to meet his mother. Now he would become her destroyer. The teenage duke who rode toward Tordesillas in November 1517 bore Joanna's auburn hair and sharp intelligence, but his heart pumped pure Burgundian ice. Raised by the same Flemish nobles who'd tormented his mother, Charles saw Joanna not as a parent but as a problem to be managed. The meeting was orchestrated like a state execution. Charles's advisors prepared him carefully. "Your mother may seem rational. Don't be deceived. Mad people often have lucid moments. Show respect but maintain distance. Remember, the stability of your realm depends on her continued indisposition." But when Charles entered Joanna's chambers, something unexpected happened. The madwoman who greeted him spoke perfect Flemish, his native tongue, which she'd learned for his dead father. She asked detailed questions about his education, his health, his journey. She knew the names of his tutors, his favorite subjects, even his horse's bloodline. This wasn't madness. This was a mother starved for 17 years of her son's life. Charles stumbled over his prepared speeches. He'd expected raving, violence, the theatrical madness his advisors had promised. Instead, Joanna offered him political advice that would have impressed Machiavelli. Trust no one completely. The Flemish want your money, the Spanish want your presence. Give neither everything they demand. For one breathtaking moment, witnesses saw Charles lean forward, genuinely engaged. Mother and son, matching intelligences sparking across the divide of years. Then his chief advisor, Chievres, coughed meaningfully. Charles straightened, mask sliding back into place. "You seem tired, Mother. Perhaps you should rest." "I've been resting for 17 years, Joanna replied quietly. "I could rule tomorrow if you'd let me." That's when Charles made his choice. He looked at this brilliant woman, his mother, the rightful queen, and saw only a threat. If Joanna was sane, his own legitimacy crumbled. If she could rule, why shouldn't she? The equation was simple. His power required her prison. But Charles refined his grandfather's methods with bureaucratic precision. Where Ferdinand had been cruel, Charles was clinical. He established the Household of the Queen Mother, a formal department dedicated to her imprisonment. He appointed Bernardino de Sandoval y Rojas, Marquis of Denia, as her keeper, a man who viewed his role as sacred duty. The new regime began immediately. Charles ordered detailed reports on his mother's every word, movement, meal. Servants logged when she slept, what she ate, how many times she paced her 20 steps. These reports, preserved in Spanish archives, read like laboratory notes on a caged specimen. Tuesday, Queen walked 18 circuits, ate half portion, spoke to no one. Wednesday, Queen asked for news of children, told nothing per standing orders, remained calm. Charles institutionalized what Ferdinand had improvised. He created official protocols for managing the Queen Mother's condition. Visitors required written permission from the emperor himself. Conversations must be witnessed by two officials. Any signs of excitement meant immediate isolation. He transformed cruelty into bureaucracy. The heartbreak lived in the details. Joanna would embroider shirts for Charles, working elaborate designs with her still clever fingers. Charles never wore them, never acknowledged them. She wrote letters he never received. She saved portions of her meager meals, for when Charles visits again, he never did. Here's what the official histories won't tell you. Charles feared his mother, not her madness, but her sanity. Every report from Denia confirmed what that first meeting had shown. Joanna remained sharp, informed despite her isolation, capable of complex reasoning. She was gunpowder awaiting a spark, and Charles spent his reign ensuring no flame came near. The proof came in his defensive measures. He spread fresh propaganda about her violence, her delusions, her danger. He commissioned portraits showing her wild-eyed and disheveled. He paid historians to document her deterioration. But why work so hard to prove something supposedly obvious? Because Charles knew the truth. His mother wasn't mad. She was imprisoned. The Spanish nobles knew it too. Whispers circulated in court about the Eagle of Tordesillas, their nickname for the caged queen who still had talons. Some brave souls petitioned Charles to ease her conditions. His response was swift transfer to distant posts. The message was clear. Joanna was not to be discussed. But then came 1520, and everything Charles feared materialized. The Comuneros' revolt erupted across Castile, and their first demand shocked the emperor to his core. Free Queen Joanna! Let the rightful sovereign rule. Suddenly, his imprisoned mother wasn't just a family secret, but a rallying cry for revolution. The rebels marched on Tordesillas itself. What they found when they broke down her door would expose 40 years of lies and change everything, except Joanna's fate. Then came the revolt that would reveal everything, and Charles would learn that some truths are too powerful to stay buried, even behind palace walls. When the rebels broke down her door, they found not a madwoman, but a queen. The Comuneros revolutionaries had expected to discover a broken creature, driven insane by 4 decades of isolation. Instead, Juan de Padilla and his men stood transfixed, as Joanna of Castile rose from her chair with perfect royal bearing and asked, "Have you come to free your queen? Or to gawk at the empire's most famous prisoner?" It was August 29, 1520, and sunshine flooded through Joanna's open door for the first time in 11 years. The rebels fell to their knees, some weeping openly. Here was their rightful sovereign, clear-eyed and commanding, living proof of the great lie that had stolen Castile's crown. Padilla would later write, "We found not madness but majesty, not confusion but clarity that cut like a blade." Joanna wasted no time. "Tell me everything," she commanded, and for hours she absorbed 40 years of hidden history. Her mother's death, concealed for 4 years. Her father's remarriage and betrayals. Her children's fates, marriages, deaths. Charles's wars, taxes, foreign advisors draining Castile's wealth. She processed each revelation with terrifying composure, filing information with the same intelligence that had mastered 6 languages. But one detail shattered her control. When Padilla mentioned her daughter Catherine had died in childbirth in 1517, Joanna's hands flew to her chest. "When?" she whispered. "January," Padilla replied gently. 3 years ago, Your Majesty. The guards had brought her extra candles that month, told her it was for Epiphany. She'd been embroidering baby clothes for grandchildren already dead. The Comuneros begged Joanna to lead them. Here was their chance, the rightful queen freed, ready to reclaim her throne from the foreign usurper. They painted a glorious picture. Charles deposed, Castilian freedoms restored, Joanna crowned in Toledo as she should have been decades ago. All she had to do was sign her name to their proclamations. Joanna listened carefully, asked penetrating questions about their military positions, their noble support, their chances of success. The rebel leaders grew more excited with each query. Clearly this brilliant woman would join their cause. Then she made the statement that would seal her fate. "You fight for Castile's freedom. I am Castile's queen, but I will not sign my name to civil war against my own son." The room erupted. Padilla pleaded. Others shouted. Some wept with frustration. How could she choose her jailer over her kingdom? But Joanna held firm with tragic dignity. A mother who wars against her child is more mad than anything they've accused me of. Find another way. Here's the part that breaks your heart. She knew exactly what her refusal meant. When you lose, she told Padilla quietly, and you will lose without royal authority. Charles will ensure I never see daylight again, but I would rather die in darkness than live with my son's blood on my hands. The Comuneros tried everything. They brought her royal regalia, hoping ceremony would change her mind. She touched the crown gently but didn't put it on. They showed her letters from supporters across Castile. She read each one but wouldn't reply. They even brought her to the castle walls to see the cheering crowds. She waved once, then returned to her chambers. For 7 months, Tordesillas became the strangest court in Europe. The Comuneros controlled the castle but couldn't control the queen they'd freed. Joanna held audiences, dispensed wisdom, showed every sign of sanity, except the one that mattered. She wouldn't sign. Without her signature, the rebels were just rebels. With it, they'd be loyalists. The end came in April 1521. Charles's forces retook Tordesillas after a brutal battle. As imperial soldiers stormed the castle, Padilla made one last plea. Joanna embraced him, the first human warmth she'd felt in decades, and whispered, "Die well, my brave knight. Someone should." Charles's vengeance was swift and terrible. Padilla and the other leaders were executed, their heads decorated pikes as warnings. But for Joanna, Charles reserved special punishment. She'd proven her sanity to thousands of witnesses. She'd shown royal dignity and maternal mercy. She'd revealed the empire's foundational lie. This could never happen again. The Marquis of Denia received new orders that chilled even hardened courtiers. Joanna's already tiny world would shrink further. Windows bricked over. Visitors banned completely. Even servants reduced to the absolute minimum. But worse was coming. Charles had learned his lesson prison walls weren't enough for a woman who could inspire revolution with her mere existence. His solution would horrify even saints. The woman who'd refused to sign her name to her son's death warrant was about to discover there were worse things than death, and Charles would ensure she experienced them all. Her refusal to sign would seal her fate forever, but not in the way she'd imagined. The walls were about to close, in ways that would make her previous imprisonment seem like mercy. That's when they brought in the Masons. The May morning of 1525 started like any other in Joanna's shrinking world, until she heard the scrape of trowels and smelled fresh mortar. Through her barred window, she watched workers unload bricks, stones, heavy wooden beams. Her keeper, the Marquis of Denia, appeared in her doorway, with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something almost like pity. "Your son has ordered modifications for your safety," he announced. Joanna, now 75, simply nodded. After 46 years of imprisonment, she recognized final defeats. But even she couldn't imagine what Charles had designed. Not just a prison, but an erasure. The work began at her windows. Not content with bars, the masons built stone frames that left only slits for light. Her world dimmed to perpetual twilight. Next came the doors. Her 2 rooms were sealed into one, with only a single entrance controlled by triple locks. The walkway where she'd paced her 20 steps, walled off entirely. Her universe contracted to one chamber, 12 feet by 15 feet. But Charles's architectural cruelty reached deeper. He ordered acoustic modifications, extra walls filled with sand to muffle sound. Joanna's voice, which had once commanded kingdoms, now died inches from her lips. Even if she screamed, the world wouldn't hear. The woman who'd spoken 6 languages was being buried in silence. The details revealed methodical horror. Her furniture was replaced with pieces too heavy to lift. She couldn't barricade doors or break windows. Her plates were wood, her cups pewter, nothing that could become a weapon, even against herself. The walls were plastered smooth, painted white, no cracks to count, no imperfections to study, nothing to occupy a brilliant mind except its own thoughts. Here's what the construction records show. Charles spent more on Joanna's architectural tomb than on actual fortifications against French invasion. Every detail was specified in his own hand. The height of the ceiling, just low enough to feel oppressive. The angle of the light slits, allowing illumination but no view. The thickness of doors, sufficient to contain a lion. Denier's reports from this period read like observations of a laboratory experiment. The Queen has stopped asking for news. The Queen no longer requests visits to the chapel. The Queen speaks only when directly addressed. Each line documented a human being systematically, reduced to mere existence. But Joanna fought back in the only way left. She refused to cooperate with her own dehumanization. When servants entered, she maintained full royal protocol, requiring proper announcements and ceremonies. When meals arrived, now through a slot in the door, she insisted on proper presentation. She was queen of 12 square feet, but by God, she was still queen. The physical changes were horrifying. Deprived of sunlight, her skin grew translucent, limited to shuffling steps in her tiny space. Her legs weakened until standing required effort. Her famous auburn hair, now white, grew wild because she refused to let servants close enough to arrange it properly. But her eyes witnesses who glimpsed her reported those dark eyes still blazed with terrible intelligence. Charles received regular updates on his mother's deterioration. His responses were bureaucratic masterpieces of emotional absence. Ensure the Queen lacks nothing necessary for life. Not comfort, not dignity, just life. He'd transformed his mother into a state secret that breathed, a problem solved by architecture and administrative precision. The cruelest twist. Charles justified this to himself as mercy. Dead, Joanna would become a martyr. Alive but invisible, she was simply forgotten. He'd given her what rebels and rivals couldn't complete: irrelevance. The woman whose mere existence had sparked revolution now existed in a space smaller than a merchant's closet. Servants assigned to her care rarely lasted long. The horror of watching a human being buried alive broke even hardened guards. They reported nightmares of her voice calling through stone walls, of her fingers tracing invisible patterns on smooth plaster, of finding her standing motionless in the exact center of her cell, as if the walls might crush her if she moved. But sometimes, late at night, they heard something else. Singing. Joanna would sing lullabies she'd once crooned to baby Charles, love songs she'd composed for Philip, hymns her mother Isabella had taught her. The sound, muffled by sand-filled walls, seemed to come from underground, a ghost who hadn't died yet, haunting her own tomb. The worst part? This wasn't the end. Joanna would survive another 30 years in this architectural coffin, outliving the son who buried her. Diplomats would visit, saints would weep, but the walls would hold. Even saints would weep at what they found behind those walls, but Charles had built them too well. Some prisons are made of iron, some of stone, and some, the cruelest ones, are made of family. Francis Borgia expected to meet a madwoman. Instead, he met a genius in rags. The future saint arrived at Tordesillas in 1550 as Charles V's personal envoy, prepared for the theatrical madness decades of propaganda had promised. What he found in that 12-foot cell would haunt him until his death and contribute to his eventual conversion to religious life. The door required 3 keys and 2 strong men to open. The stench hit first 45 years of inadequate ventilation, of a body slowly dying in its own air. Then his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw her. Joanna sat perfectly straight in a chair held together with rope, wearing a gown that had once been royal purple but now resembled burial cloth. Her hair, wild and white, framed a face of terrible dignity. "You're not my son," she said clearly, "but you have his eyes. Who are you?" Borgia had prepared speeches about Charles's concern, about spiritual comfort, about accepting God's will. They died in his throat. Instead, he found himself answering honestly: his name, his position, his family connections. Joanna listened with the focused attention of someone relearning human conversation, then began asking questions that revealed a mind sharp as winter ice. She knew about the Protestant Reformation despite decades of isolation. She'd deduced Charles's wars from servant gossip and supply requisitions. She'd calculated the year from feast days and guard rotations. This wasn't madness. This was genius, surviving on crumbs of information, building world maps from shadows and whispers. But then Borgia made a mistake. He mentioned her grandson, Philip, Charles's son and heir. Joanna's composure cracked like struck glass. "Philip?" she whispered. "My Philip?" For one heartbreaking moment, she thought her long-dead husband had returned. Then, understanding dawned, and with it, mathematics. My grandson. Named for his grandfather. How old? 23, Your Majesty. The silence stretched until Borgia realized she was calculating. Years lost. Grandchildren never seen. Great-grandchildren born and grown in her darkness. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of geological time. I've been here longer than he's been alive. Borgia's official report mentioned a successful visit and the Queen's acceptable condition. His private letters, discovered centuries later, told different truths. I have seen Christ's passion reenacted, he wrote. An innocent buried alive, bearing witness to resurrection while still breathing. The Queen's sanity is perfect. Her imprisonment is perfect sacrilege. He wasn't the only witness. In 1554, Philip himself, Joanna's grandson, visited while travelling to England for his marriage to Mary Tudor. The meeting was brief, formal, devastating. Joanna studied this young man, wearing her dead husband's name and face, then asked one question: Do you know you're named for a man who destroyed me? The diplomatic records show Philip left within an hour, deeply affected by the Queen's condition. He also left orders that her comfort be increased, orders Charles immediately countermanded. The grandson had seen too much truth. The walls needed to hold a little longer. Even servants became unwitting witnesses. Maria de Ulloa, assigned to Joanna's care in her final years, kept illegal notes. She recorded a woman who maintained perfect royal etiquette in a space smaller than a peasant's pantry, who recited epic poems in 6 languages to walls that swallowed sound, who created imaginary courts where she dispensed justice to invisible petitioners, not from madness, but to keep her mind sharp as her body failed. The most damning testimony came from Joanna's doctor, Santa Cara. Called to examine her in 1554, he expected to confirm decades of madness. Instead, his medical report, buried in archives and discovered only recently, stated plainly, the Queen suffers no mental deficiency. Her physical deterioration stems entirely from confinement. She demonstrates remarkable intelligence, given circumstances that would break Stoic philosophers. But here's the truly horrifying part everyone knew. Charles knew. Philip knew. The Council of Castile knew. The chain of complicity stretched from emperor to stable boy, each person choosing blindness over action, because acknowledging Joanna's sanity meant acknowledging monstrous injustice. Easier to maintain the lie, to perfect their concerned expressions when foreign ambassadors asked after poor mad Joanna. The witnesses accumulated like evidence at a trial that would never come. Confessors who heard perfect theological arguments from supposed madness. Servants who watched her trace architectural plans of palaces from memory on her cell floor. Guards who reported she could predict their shift changes, weather patterns, feast days, all from fragments of overheard conversation. But testimony without action is merely documented cruelty. Each witness left Tordesillas shaken. Some converted to religious life, others to drink, but none to revolution. The walls held because everyone who could tear them down benefited from their standing. But her greatest act of rebellion was yet to come, one that would shake the very foundations of royal power. She discovered the one thing they couldn't take, her soul. By 1540, they'd stolen everything else: freedom, family, light, sound, space, time itself. But in the darkest corner of her 12-foot world, Joanna found a weapon that terrified Charles more than any army. She began refusing the sacraments. For a Spanish Catholic queen to reject communion was unthinkable, blasphemous, and brilliant. Joanna had calculated perfectly. If she was truly mad, her refusal meant nothing. But if she was sane, denying her the sacraments while she lived was damning her soul. Charles faced an impossible choice: admit his mother was rational enough to make spiritual decisions, or risk her eternal damnation. The first priest who came to her cell in 1541 expected easy compliance from a broken old woman. Instead, Joanna sat silent through his entire mass, lips sealed when he offered the host. I cannot receive Christ, she said clearly, while living in hell created by those who should protect me. The priest fled, reportedly pale as death. Charles sent theologians, bishops, eventually Cardinal Tavera himself. Each met the same response: perfect theological arguments delivered in flawless Latin. God sees all, Joanna would say. He sees these walls. He sees who built them. Would you have me take communion while my soul screams for justice he already hears? But Joanna's spiritual rebellion went deeper. She began what witnesses called her living funeral, systematic preparation for death while stubbornly refusing to die. She divided her few possessions, dictating precise instructions for their distribution, a worn prayer book to the grandson she'd never met, a ring, hidden for decades, to a servant who'd shown kindness. Each bequest a message: I am here, I remember, I choose. The hunger strikes started in 1545, not the dramatic refusals that might suggest madness, but calculated fasts that followed obscure saints' days she remembered from decades past. When concerned servants begged her to eat, she'd smile. Witnesses said that smile was terrible to see, and reply, Saint Christina survived on faith alone. Shall a queen do less? Charles, receiving reports in Brussels, grew frantic. A mother starving herself made him look monstrous. He ordered forced feeding. But how do you force feed a queen who maintains perfect dignity while you break her jaw? The attempt was made once. The servant who tried it requested immediate transfer to the Turkish front, preferring Ottoman scimitars to Joanna's eyes. So they tried negotiation. Promises of better conditions, more light, visits from grandchildren, all contingent on her taking communion. Joanna listened to each offer with the patience of stone, then refused. My soul is not for sale, she'd say. Not for windows, not for sunlight, not for all the kingdoms my son stole while I counted bricks. The most devastating weapon in her arsenal was memory. During her fasts, possibly delirious, possibly performing, she'd recite entire conversations from 50 years past. Promises Charles had made as a child. Ferdinand's lies, word for word. Philip's cruelties in perfect detail. Servants reported she'd speak to empty air as if her betrayers stood before her, conducting trials where she was judge, jury, and only witness. You said you loved me, she'd tell invisible Philip, but love doesn't lock doors. You called me father, she'd accuse Ferdinand's ghost, but fathers don't bury daughters alive. You were my sunrise, she'd whisper to Charles's absence. Now you've become my night. These performances, if performance they were, spread through servant gossip across Europe. The trials of Tordesillas became whispered legend. Kings feared death less than Joanna's judgment from her 12-foot courtroom, because what if she was right? What if God was taking notes? The church grew increasingly uncomfortable. Popes sent discreet inquiries. How could they explain a Catholic queen denied sacraments for decades? Charles's responses grew more desperate. She was too mad to receive communion, too violent, too unpredictable. But reports leaked. Joanna spent hours in prayer, knew the liturgy perfectly, showed every sign of faith except submission. By 1550, she'd refined her rebellion to an art. She'd take communion only from priests who'd publicly acknowledge her as Joanna, by grace of God, Queen of Castile, Leon, and Aragon. None would. She'd make confession only if the priest agreed to carry her words directly to the Pope. None dared. She'd turned every sacrament into a political statement, every prayer into a protest. The final twist of the knife? She announced she was writing her own liturgy, prayers for the imprisoned, the betrayed, the buried alive. She had no paper, no ink, but swore she was inscribing them on her soul for God to read directly. Charles's theologians tied themselves in knots. Could a mad woman write valid prayers? If she couldn't, why fear them? As death approached in 1555, she prepared one final message, one that would echo through centuries and haunt every royal who'd ever locked a door. She prepared one final message that would shake the very foundations of the dynasty that had entombed her. 3 generations of her blood walked past her prison, unable to see the truth. By 1550, Joanna had become Tordesillas' ghost, a legend servants whispered about, a shadow aristocrats glimpsed from carriages rolling past the castle walls. Her great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the Mad Queen, without knowing she breathed just meters from their processions, counting their hoofbeats and calculating their ages from the sound. The cruelest visits were the portraits. Charles, guilt finally gnawing at his conscience, commissioned paintings of his mother from memory. Artists who'd never seen Joanna created wild-eyed madwomen, hair streaming, hands clawed. He hung these fictions in palaces across Europe, teaching the world what madness looked like. Meanwhile, the real Joanna sat straight-backed in her cell, dignity intact despite 7 decades of systematic destruction. In 1554, something extraordinary happened. Joanna's great-granddaughter, Anna of Austria, travelling to her wedding, insisted on stopping at Tordesillas. Just 14, Anna had heard whispers that challenged the official story. Her tutor's descriptions didn't match servants' tales. She demanded to see her great-grandmother herself. The meeting was brief. Denia allowed only minutes, but those minutes changed everything. Anna found not a madwoman, but a monument. Joanna, now 74, rose from her chair with effort but perfect grace. She studied Anna's face with those terrible, intelligent eyes, then spoke one sentence. "You have my mother's smile but your grandfather's heart. Choose carefully which you follow." Anna left shaking. She would later tell her own children that she'd met neither saint nor demon but something worse, a woman who'd been turned into a lesson. "Our family's power," Anna would say, "is built on her bones." The final year brought physical disintegration that even architectural tombs couldn't hide. Joanna's legs, after decades of 12-foot worlds, could no longer support her. Her hands, which once played 6 instruments, shook too badly to hold even water. But her mind, God help them all, her mind stayed sharp as the blade that had cut her life to ribbons. She spent her last months creating what she called her invisible monument. Unable to write, she composed her life story in perfect mental chapters, reciting them to walls that swallowed sound. Servants heard fragments. Chapter 1, The Princess Who Loved Books. Chapter 12, The Years of Eating Darkness. Chapter 46, How Suns Become Stones. The approaching end brought desperate negotiations. Charles, perhaps sensing history's judgment approaching with his mother's death, sent offers. Would she see a confessor? Would she take last rites? Would she, and this mattered most, forgive? Joanna's response was magnificent in its simplicity. "Send me a priest who will hear my full confession, all 76 years. Every betrayal named, every lie documented. Then we'll discuss forgiveness." No priest came. The confession would have taken days and destroyed dynasties. On April 11, 1555, Joanna began what witnesses called her death dance. She rose from bed, impossible for months, and walked her cell's perimeter, fingers trailing the walls that had held her for 46 years. She touched each stone like old enemies, whispering numbers. Servants realized she was counting. Every day stolen, every sunrise missed, every grandchild never held. 16,790 days, she announced to the dawn of April 12. "Count them on your conscience, my son." Then Joanna of Castile, Queen of Spain, Naples, Sicily and Sardinia, Countess of Burgundy, legitimate ruler of half the known world, did what her jailers had wanted for 5 decades. She died. But first, she did something that would haunt them forever. She smiled. Witnesses swore that smile held triumph, as if death were her final victory over walls that could hold bodies but never break souls. The unseemly haste of what followed revealed everything. Within hours, before her body had even cooled, masons arrived, not to open her prison, to demolish it entirely. Charles ordered every stone of her cell removed, scattered, obliterated. He claimed it was to create a proper memorial. In truth, he was destroying evidence. But you can't demolish whispers. You can't scatter stories. You can't obliterate the truth that 3 generations of men had buried a brilliant woman alive because her existence challenged their power. The walls came down, but the ghost they'd created would haunt every throne room in Europe. Because here's what Charles never understood. You can imprison a body, but you can't imprison a legacy. Joanna had spent 46 years becoming something more terrifying than any mad queen. She'd become a mirror, reflecting the monstrosity of those who looked away. On April 12, 1555, the walls finally came down, but only for her corpse. The living woman had already escaped, transformed into a truth too powerful for any prison to hold. Now we return to where we began, that terrible day, in 1525, when the Masons came. But now you understand what led to this moment. The scrape of mortar on stone wasn't just construction, it was the sound of 3 generations perfecting the art of erasure. The bricks sliding into place weren't just a wall, they were the final bars of a cage built from fear, greed, and the terrible mathematics of power. Joanna sat in her chair, 75 years old, watching the last rectangle of sunlight shrink with each brick. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She'd learned decades ago that resistance only proved their points, gave them the evidence they craved. Instead, she did something that terrified them more. She bore witness. As the final brick approached, she spoke, not to the masons, who wouldn't meet her eyes, not to Denia, who stood supervising with bureaucratic efficiency. She spoke to history itself. I, Joanna, by grace of God, Queen of Castile, Leon, and Aragon, do hereby testify. I am not mad. I have never been mad. I am guilty only of being born royal and female, of loving those who could not love me back, of refusing to disappear quietly when my existence became inconvenient. Let the walls rise. Stone crumbles. Truth endures. The last brick slid into place. Darkness absolute. But here's what Charles never calculated in his architectural equations. Every wall creates two sides. Outside, he'd created a smooth facade, unmarked by windows or truth. Inside, he'd created something else entirely. A woman who'd spent 46 years becoming not just a prisoner but a prophet, not just a victim but a verdict on everyone who'd held the keys. For 30 more years, she survived in that darkness. 30 years of breathing recycled air, of counting heartbeats in place of sunsets, of composing symphonies no one would hear, and painting masterpieces on the canvas of closed eyelids. She outlived Philip by 49 years, Ferdinand by 39, and would nearly outlive Charles himself. When Charles abdicated in 1556, broken by wars and gout and perhaps by guilt, one of his final acts was to visit Tordesillas. He didn't enter her cell. He never did after 1525, but stood outside those blank walls. Witnesses say he placed his hand on the stone and whispered something. Some heard, "Forgive me." Others heard, "Forget me." Maybe both, maybe neither. He retired to a monastery, seeking the peace he'd denied his mother. But even monks whispered about the Queen in the walls, and Charles learned what Joanna had always known: some prisons you carry with you. The tragedy of Joanna isn't just that she was imprisoned, it's that her imprisonment worked. For centuries, history books repeated the lie. Joanna the Mad, they called her, accompanied by those wild-eyed portraits Charles commissioned. Her genuine accomplishments, the languages mastered, the territories governed during her brief freedoms, the brilliant political insights, all erased by the simpler story of feminine madness. But truth has its own architecture, stronger than any walls. In recent decades, historians have excavated the real Joanna from beneath centuries of propaganda. Document by document, testimony by testimony, they've rebuilt the woman Charles tried to demolish. What emerges isn't a mad queen, but something more unsettling: a sane woman who survived nearly 5 decades of gaslighting by an entire empire. Today, tourists visit Tordesillas. They see the riverside castle pretty in sunlight, giving no hint of its Gothic history. The cell where Joanna lived and died was indeed demolished. Charles was thorough, but you can still trace where it stood. Sometimes guards say, especially at dusk, you can hear things. Not ghostly wails or chain rattling, Joanna was never that theatrical. Just whispers, counting, 16,790 days. Because that's the final irony of Joanna's story. They turned her into a ghost story, but not the kind they intended. Not the cautionary tale of mad queens and female weakness. Instead, she became the ghost that haunts every powerful man who ever locked a door on someone inconvenient. The spectre that asks, "What are you so afraid of, that you need walls this thick?" She died on April 12, 1555, but her question lives on. In every palace, in every prison, in every place where power builds walls to hide the truth. Joanna the Mad? No. Joanna the Enduring. Joanna the Questioner. Joanna who proved that you can bury someone alive, but you can't bury the questions they leave behind. The walls always come down eventually. The only question is whether we're brave enough to look at what they were hiding.